So Trudy, we've been talking about the story of your catastrophic health event experience that lasted, many months in and around a hospital after having written about healthcare for years. And one thing you said that I want to, I'm not sure that people are aware of. You said that hospitals are very unsafe places. Why is that? And what do you mean by that?
Well, I think we've never really figured out why. Some researchers keep trying to figure it out, but there are medication errors that happen all the time. There are infections that go through hospitals. Some of the infections come from the devices that they put inside. I had what was called a PICC line in my right arm, and lots of people who are very sick have these lines in them because they make it easier to administer medicines and draw blood and so forth. And when I realized I had one of those, I thought, oh my, I've written about these. These are the object of safety campaigns in many hospitals across the country. So I knew how dangerous it was. And I kept asking people, what was going on here. And finally I learned that the site where the line was inserted had to be cleansed and redressed every few days, I think is what I was told. And then I wasn't told that until fairly late on in my stay. And then after that, when I knew what the protocol was, I could watch for it to make sure it was done. But that's just a simple thing that families can do if they know that that's something they need to keep on top of, for example.
That dynamic of and I've experienced this, like I said earlier, in the experience of caring, being with a loved one who went through pneumonia and sepsis, and also in the context of childbirth. That dynamic where we as patients, or we as just sort of lay people, go in and assume that everything that is happening in the hospital is a medical necessity. And that there is like this broad coordination across everybody who walks into your room. They've all talked to each other and they all have some sophisticated methodology of communicating. And that they're always practicing best practices. None of that seems to be true. And there is no way to communicate that to the patients and their families unless you are someone like yourself who's been writing about it. I was fortunate enough to have someone who works in the medical profession, sort of coaching me from afar, and had witnessed another friend of mine go through a series of medical issues over years. But if you don't have that level of savvy, you don't even know to question what's going on.
No, that's exactly right. And I think that's, I think what our concern is, and we've known for about 20, 25 years that there were these problems in hospitals, and there have been all kinds of panels being done on it and educational sessions for reporters by different groups over the years and so on. But I think that we may have been barking up the wrong tree here. We have all these metrics that have come about, and one of the things, and I probably contributed to this too, because I was a big proponent of how we can measure things and put ratings up. We rated nursing homes and other healthcare entities, and you tell people that this one's the best or this one's the best. And in the end, unless you're having a baby and can choose your obstetrician, you're not in any position to do a whole lot of shopping in comparison of anything once you are a patient in a hospital with a serious illness. You're pretty much at the mercy of whatever they're going to do. That's not to say you or your family shouldn't be asking a whole lot of questions, because you should. And one of the things that we did that was really very beneficial, we realized at one facility that there was a pulmonologist that was assigned to me that we didn't want. We didn't like him. And he showed up very late at night to do his rounds, and I had to go to sleep. I mean, it was just not good. So my daughter and I waged a campaign to get somebody else in there that we really wanted, and the facility listened to us, and we finally did get who we wanted. And I think that the point is most patients don't believe that they can fire a doctor if the doctor or the hospital practitioner is doing something they don't like. They're very much afraid to speak up. And I think that's one of the things that we learned from this whole experience, that you have to speak up.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, because that dynamic you're talking about, I think people even have that with their car mechanic, but the implications of that relationship, the intimidation, because I don't know anything about the car and this person's a mechanic, so they must know something about the car. I can't question them. That dynamic is similar, I think, in the context of being in a hospital. But here is the question, because the implications of, someone maybe, a mechanic saying to you, you need synthetic oil, or you don't need synthetic oil. The implications of that are far less significant than maybe a doctor who's being a little bit sloppy, or who, is not providing the care that you want, or communicating with your other doctors, or whatever it is. Is there, from your perspective, the combination of having written on this stuff and also been a patient, a policy prescription, right? I mean, if we don't have the ability as a patient in the most dire and really most relevant circumstances to do informed shopping because we're a patient, are there policy prescriptions that will take care of this, before we're in that situation?
Well, I think one of the things I learned early on when I started covering this really rather rigorously sometime in the 90s, I said to a person who was running a hospital unit at the time in New York City, and I said, well, what do we really do about these problems? Because the shopping stuff isn't really going to get us anywhere. And he said, well, I guess we could regulate the hospitals more than we do. And so you either put the onus on the family or the consumer to do this, quote, shopping, which is not very useful in some of these situations, and I would argue in most of these situations, or you bring in the regulators and you regulate the hospitals, and you really find out whether or not they are wearing gloves like the hospital says they're supposed to. I mean, one night I chased away a couple of aides because it was at the height of the flu season, and they came in and they wouldn't put on gloves. And I said, you're not touching me, and I asked them to leave. And I think that it's, the patient in that case has to sort of be the eyes and ears here. But really, somebody in authority needs to say, the hospital needs to be monitoring this, or they're going to get penalized in some way. Because, not everybody is going to have the guts to say to this guy who comes in, you're not going to touch me because you don't have any gloves on. And that's just one example. And I don't know that they're very stringently regulated. It's quite an open question of what's going on. I do think in one area are some policy prescriptions that we need to work on, and I didn't address this in the piece because it was getting so long. But around discharge planning and the options that a family has when you're being transferred from facility to facility, as I was. I mean, I went to 4 different places before all this was over. And my family learned that you really don't have any control where you're going. And this whole notion that you can choose your hospital or you can choose your facility is crazy, because in those situations you have no choice. It's all decided for you. And my daughter found that when it was time to leave the first hospital, that clearly wanted me out for whatever reason. We really never knew. She tried to find a place in Manhattan for me and couldn't, and found that she couldn't even get in the door. They wouldn't even speak to her, that all this is decided between the 2 facilities that are involved. And so I think then the disclosure that's given to people is not adequate. It's pretty much useless. I think the recourse that people have at the end to object and to file complaints is pretty useless. So I think there are some policy prescriptions that can be done and should be done around that whole area. And I know one of the things I found when I was going to rehab, because I had to learn to walk again and use my arms because everything had kind of atrophied, I would meet people over at the rehab place here in New York, and people realized I was a writer, and they said, well, why don't you write a book or something and tell us what to do, because we don't know any of this. And I thought a lot about that as I observed them waiting for my therapist to come in and call me. She would say, the people would say, we don't know what to do. We just sort of were, I had a stroke when I was 55. I'm 56 now. We don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. And I think there's a whole lot more that we can do on that end of it, that at least it's a start.
Yeah, well, Trudy, it's a fascinating story. I can't encourage people to read it enough. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.